Thank you for joining me for the final session that I'll be teaching for the Civic Life Project and this Bridging Communities Project on Healing Divides. This is on filming B-roll. So there'll be a lot of information I'll give you if you either watch the recording or we're here live for our sessions on filming an interview and filming a documentary with a cell phone. You know that there's a lot of information that I give. So you're definitely going to want to, if you can, take notes. I'm going to try and come back to a lot of key ideas. So I'll repeat myself a lot just because I know that there's a lot of information that I can give you, right? You're not going to become a professional filmmaker from listening to this. You're not going to absorb everything I teach you tonight. So I definitely will repeat myself a few times so that you can know what the key concepts are. So welcome, and let's begin. The first thing I want to address when we talk about B-roll is, of course, what is B-roll? When we make a movie, one way to think of it is A-roll and B-roll. The A-roll, when you make a film, are the interviews you're going to go out and film. The B-roll is going to be the footage you put over that B-roll, over that A-roll, that's going to turn it into a film. A real movie for people to watch. And when you separate documentary filmmaking into these two different categories, A-roll and your B-roll, your interviews and your B-roll, it can really help you start to sift through it, and it stops becoming such an overwhelming idea. Because if we really distill down what it means to make a documentary film, especially in a high school classroom environment, it's very simple. We start out, we're going to do some research, right? Then we sit down with some people and we conduct some interviews, right? Once you have those interviews, you choose the very best parts of those interviews to use in your film. And then the final step, or not final, it's happening as you're working, is you have B-roll that you're going to cover everything with. So I like to sort of, when I work with students, really break this down into pieces, really think about, okay, who do we want to speak to for our film? And what kind of imagery do we want to see? And now for a lot of films, right off the bat, you know what kind of B-roll you're going to want to see, right? While other films, and this is true in almost all situations, is that after you conduct your interviews, you get ideas of additional B-roll to shoot. So that's why I say when we're talking about filming B-roll, it really is something that you're going to be doing throughout the filmmaking process. But it can help to make it less overwhelming, especially for your students, to kind of separate those things and say, okay, guys, we're going to shoot some interviews and we got to get some B-roll to cover the interviews. You think of it that simply, it becomes a very manageable task. So first up, types of B-roll, right? What types of B-roll are we going to be filming, and what types of B-roll might we see? So probably the most common B-roll that students end up using in their films is stuff they find on the internet. So not B-roll they've shot themselves. And that happens because of a pretty obvious situation in a classroom environment. And that's you have a limited amount of time in class during the school day to work on your projects. And what usually happens is that the students spend most of the school year editing their films. Shooting and editing. And what happens is at the end of the school year, where all the interviews have been edited, everything's been put together, voiceover's been recorded, it's been added in to bridge the gaps. It's then that we go, oh man, this is the B-roll we actually need, right? It's then towards the end of the year that we start really thinking about the specific pieces that we're going to see when we're watching this film. And that's tough. And so that means that what happens is for many students is you start going online and looking for footage. So my first piece of advice here is if you're going to go online and look for footage, never poo-poo finding photos. There's tons of whatever civil rights or community issue you address, there's probably going to be some photos that exist out there. And I always like to have a student, and if you're a student making a film, doing a Google image search, just make sure you set your settings at a very advanced setting so you have very high level images that you're collecting. Having one student on the team dedicated just to that, finding photos and compiling high resolution photos that could work for your film is really helpful to do. And also, I love aparchives.org. There are definitely other places to look for it, but AP Archives, they've basically digitized their entire catalog of any AP story in the time of television that was ever filed by any camera operator anywhere in the world. They've digitized and it's up there, and you can search this. So you can type in any date in history from basically 1950 onward, and you can find whatever was filed on that day. It's so cool. As like a teacher who's taught history and taught filmmaking, like I could just play in AP Archives all day. So that's a great lifesaver if you're making this film and you start to get to that point, as we all do, going, oh my God, like now that we've edited these interviews together, we really need to cover these interviews with some interesting footage. And what are we going to film, right? You interview someone about civil rights, or you interview someone about something that happened in your community, and you don't have footage for it. Hop on AP Archives, and it's an awesome resource. So those are sort of I put those in the categories like photos and AP Archives in the B-roll category of your stock footage, right? These are things that were shot by someone else. They're already in the can, and you can draw on them. My warning on that is that frequently what happens is towards the end of the editing process, we get to a point where you're in May, maybe early June, if you've got a late deadline, where students end up like going to YouTube to try and find things. And I get it, right? I mean, it is the place in our modern society we go for footage. And I've definitely done that before with students. Like, we really need something. And usually it's silly. I mean, I remember one film, we had a pastor talking about capital punishment, and he mentions a quote from the Bible about a man being thrown into the sea. So the teacher and the students realized that, like, oh my God, for this moment of our film, we want to cut to a shot of the ocean. So either we're going to either go on YouTube and find a shot of the ocean for when this pastor talks about this idea, or we're going to go down Long Island Sound and we're going to film the ocean. I think they ended up actually going down to the Sound and filming it. So that was cool. That was some on-location B-roll, which is what we'll talk about next. But more often than not, you end up going on YouTube because you're looking for little silly things. And that's why the B-roll process inevitably goes right up to the very end, because you might know at the very start of your filmmaking process, okay, we're doing a film on the death penalty. I want to have some images of prisons. I had students who actually got access to a prison. A prison, I think, provided the team with some promotional footage the prison had. I don't know what promotional footage the prison has, but they did. They had like a sort of media footage that of the inside of the prison, of prison doors closing, the students were able to gain access to, and they used that. So sometimes you can predict. That's like predictable B-roll. We're making a film about X topic. We'll want footage of that. Same like if you did a documentary about the civil rights movement, you know, okay, I'm going to go on AP Archives. I can find footage from the day of the march on this bridge in Selma. I can find other speeches by Martin Luther King, other civil rights activists. Those are like the predictable B-roll things you can find. But there's the unpredictable, which you don't know until you've edited an interview together, that someone uses an anecdotal story about, this morning I woke up and I poured myself a cup of coffee and I was reading the newspaper and suddenly it dawned on me and I had a euphoric moment. Someone says that and you use it in your film and suddenly you're editing and go, oh, he says he woke up in the morning, he poured himself a cup of coffee and he's reading the newspaper. All right, guys, we got to do we do like an alarm clock, like just show the blinking light, you know, cup of coffee? Do we want to film like a close-up of like someone lifting up a cup of coffee? Do we want to film a shot of the newspaper and someone sort of flipping through a newspaper in the morning? We don't see who it is, we just see the hands. And you start thinking that way. And when you do that, it can really bring your film to life, right? Someone's talking about an anecdotal story or describing something, and every single thing someone says in an interview, you're thinking, what kind of image could I use for that? And sometimes they're not predictable. Sometimes we don't know the footage we're going to need until the whole movie's assembled. And then we know we need additional B-roll that we didn't predict. And that's why as teachers, as students, frequently we get to this point at the end of the school year of going like, oh my God, what am I going to do? Students are going on YouTube, they're trying to get stuff. So what we want to try and do is predict B-roll we might need when we start the process, but also just be aware that you're going to have that moment at the end of the process where you're going to want more footage. So try and get your film edited and finished with enough space before the deadline that you could go out and you could film more things. When I make a film, I try and do an assembly, which is where I take all the selects we made, I put them on the timeline. Then I do a rough cut, a fine cut, and then a final cut. And so when we do our assembly, we get everything on the timeline, all our favorite selects. That's a really good point to go, okay, what are all these selects we have? And are there any moments here where someone's describing something that's very visual that we're going to want to go out and do that? And as soon as all your interviews are completed, you can make that assembly and then assess that for like, where are the B-roll moments? Like, am I going to schedule a field trip? If I'm a student, am I going to go out on a weekend and try and get that a shot for that particular moment? So that's what we start thinking about, because it's so hard. It definitely becomes the weakest point in student-made films is getting good B-roll. And that's why we're here today. So B-roll, let's talk a little bit more about this. Okay, so we just talked about our stock B-roll, right? So these are things that you're going to find on the internet. AP Archives is great. Footage is great. So this could be footage that you, photos or any kind of footage you find online. We call that stock footage. And with AP Archives, you can get permission. It's helpful if you have a teacher, or if you are a teacher, you can reach out to them. You can create a login on the AP website, and you can actually say, hey, there's a way to actually submit a request and say you're making this film, it's a student film, could you have access? And sometimes they will give you access to basically lower resolution download versions that you can use. You can pay for like the really high resolution stuff, but I'll be honest, like I've used the low res exports for a lot of student films, and no one notices. You blow it up in Adobe Premiere and it looks great, so don't even worry about it. So that's your stock footage. The next big one is graphics. So graphic design is a really helpful approach when you're making a documentary, especially if there are a lot of complex ideas. Graphics for B-roll could mean a photo with some on-screen text. It could mean an animation of a graph. It could be a chart, could be a pie chart, whatever it is. Those kind of things you might use to show statistics, things like that. I personally think that a lot of those graphics can be a little bit boring. I try and avoid that. If I can have someone describe something and I can create a scene in my films, I want to do that versus just cutting to graphics. But graphics are a tool that we'll use all the time, especially if we're trying to get rid of talking heads, right? Having just talking heads, so just the interview footage in your film, is really hard for an audience to sit through, even for a 5 to 8 minute film. So sometimes we come down to it like, okay, we just got to find some kind of graphic. All right, so we got our stock footage, we've got graphics, and then finally, there's the stuff that you shoot yourself. Now, this is going to be the best stuff, and this is what we're going to focus on today, is how do you get really good footage that you have shot yourself, because that's going to make your film really come to life. So stuff you've shot yourself. There's a few different ways to collect footage for something like this. First off, there is when you actually film your interview, that's a great moment to get some B-roll. There's usually not too much you get to do, but it's very important. If you're going on a field trip or you're just taking your time on a weekend to go meet with someone, is to think about, when we're there today, what footage should we try and get? Because it's going to be really helpful to have this stuff, right? You have the person who's going to be in your movie, and yeah, sure, they may have put time aside in a very busy day for you, but if you can ask them to do something simple like type it at their computer. We had a film done last year where students interviewed this wonderful African-American woman who is a descendant of one of the founding members of our community who was an African-American, and it was sort of an uncovering the past project. It was really interesting. And she had done all this genealogy work, and she describes this genealogy work to the students. So obviously, as we're interviewing her, we're realizing that one of the things that'd be really great to see her do, she's talking about how empowering it was to do this genealogy research to discover this about her. And I was like, guys, you need to write on a computer. Like, it might sound kind of boring, but someone just at their computer doing their genealogy research, that's something you want to have. So really frequently, when I'm on an interview with someone, I might ask them whatever their job is or whatever we're interviewing them about, can they do it for us on camera, right? If it was a painter you were interviewing, you would ask them after the interview to maybe paint something, right? And shoot some close-ups of their hand, their brush strokes. You might shoot some footage of the actual image coming together. Someone who's a researcher, like in this case of the slavery film, we want to see this woman actually researching, right? Just being at her computer. So you have to be willing to kind of go out on a limb, put yourself out there and just ask somebody. Be like, hey, would it be okay if you would sit at your computer and type something for us? Or with an artist, I usually with things like that, if it's something they have to really do, I might ask them in advance, might predict that, right? It might be something that's a predictable B-roll and say, hey, we're going to be there. Would it be possible after the interview to shoot some B-roll of you actually working? And it's really nice if you can ask that in an email before you show up, because then the person's going to be way more willing to get into it. They might be very excited about it. This last week ago, I was making a film with some students about temperature monitoring. So it was on climate change, and we had some scientists who were monitoring temperatures in cold water streams. And they were installing these temperature monitors. So they're these tubes, they sink into the creek, and they put these temperature sensors into the tubes, and they have them down there. So one of the simple things was to ask, very predictable, was, can we film you going out on one of these days, installing a temperature monitor? And these people said, yes, absolutely, please come with us. And we were able to basically be flies on the wall. We mic'd them, but we stood back and we let them just walk out into the forest and install these temperature monitors, and we were circling them, filming them. And sometimes we weren't completely a sort of cinema verite, which is the cinema of life where you're just sort of observing. Sometimes we said, hey, could you do that again? Could you repeat that one thing for us? And so they worked with us, and they were very cool, but they were into it because we had talked to them early on in the process of saying, hey, the coolest thing that we're gonna get from you is to see you actually do this. I've worked on films where someone has called me who's a subject of the documentary. This one real world example, this guy called me and he's like, Ben, we're gonna go into Lake Champlain. We're going in. We're going in. I'm gonna scuba dive in Lake Champlain. It's gonna be amazing. And I realized as this guy was telling me this very excitedly that it had actually already happened. He already had gone into Lake Champlain. He had already scuba dived. He had already done this very exciting thing. And he was trying to tell me about it. He's just very excited about it. So the tense was a little screwed up. And so it was a great lesson for me. It's something I always try and convey to subjects of documentaries, is that we want to film you doing something. We want to see if there's something that you're going to do. If you're an activist and you're going to some protest soon, please tell us about it. Please let us know. We'd love to be there. If you're, even if it's like, hey, you're going to be on a Zoom call with a bunch of other activists. Hey, can we join that Zoom call? Can we be there? Can we record it? It could be really cool for our film. So just asking people and telling them like, hey, we want to see footage of you doing something. It's so important. And if you establish that early on, that's really helpful. So that is the first really type of B-roll that you're going to be able to film yourself, right? It's something very much associated with the interviews you're shooting, right? And that means that you're going to ask the person who's being interviewed, maybe on the day of the interview, to also demonstrate something or pose. We've seen it on the news, right? It's the person walking down the hall going, and the journalist is walking next to them going, oh, okay, very interesting, yeah. And they're walking down the hallway and the camera's slowly zooming out. It's like the most cliche journalist shot we've seen, but that's because it's an easy one, right? You interview someone at their office, you ask them to walk down the hall, and you slowly zoom out with them. So that's the kind of thing that you shoot when you're on location. Something for me too, when I'm going for an interview, is I also start paying attention to things that I see, right, in the town. So if I'm going to go interview someone in Glastonbury, Connecticut, as we did for this past film, it was one on slavery as well. And as we're going into Glastonbury, of course, I'm thinking, all right, we should get some shots of this town because our voiceover is definitely going to say, we interviewed so-and-so who's from Glastonbury, Connecticut. So I'm like, okay. because of that 1 second moment when the voiceover is going to say the words Glastonbury, Connecticut. I need like all that kind of tourist promo shots of Glastonbury. I need the drone flying over Glastonbury. I need the welcome sign, welcome to Glastonbury. So I got to think I'm going to shoot signage. I want to shoot like, some iconic kind of vistas of the town. If is there a hill I can be on? So just that one simple thing suddenly created all this B-roll that I'm going to film. Once I get to a physical location, so I get to a town hall to interview someone, first thing I'm thinking is, okay, I want to film the actual exterior of the town hall so that when the voiceover says, we interviewed the mayor at town hall, I can have an establishing shot of town hall before we cut into the interview, right? So you're getting this, you're trying to think about on the day of the interview, what are things we can get today that is going to be a big pain to get later on? And it's usually really simple stuff, but it's so important to get that, especially, during COVID, I don't know like what this year is going to mean, but when we were able to go on lots of field trips, that was a big thing. It's not just about going for the interview, it's how much B-roll can I get when I'm on a field trip. If you're an individual student working on this project, you might be doing it on your own time. And so it might be, okay, my parents are driving me somewhere to do an interview. What else can I film on that day? Always important to think about. So you have that, right? It's the B-roll you're going to shoot on the day of the interview that's going to help. It usually involves the person being interviewed in some way, right? That's the first thing to think about. The next thing to think about is predictable B-roll. Knowing the topic you've chosen, is there B-roll that you're probably going to need? Can you predict some B-roll that you're going to want that you can actually shoot yourself? So to use my previous example of the water temperature monitoring project, we knew immediately at the start of it that we were going to be traipsing around in cold water streams getting footage. So I actually spent, before we interviewed anyone, we went down to a river, there was a canoe kind of boat launch area, and we brought a little GoPro and we just started filming really creative underwater shots under the river. We started filming things like that because we knew no matter what we get from our interviews, that it's very predictable that we're just going to want to have shots of water, shots of the river, water flowing over the camera, shots of iconic locations on the river. So I try and think about that. And if I can do that as a teacher, like on day one, or as any kind of filmmaker and go, all right, I can predict I'll need this footage. That way you can set up shoot dates. You can say, okay, hey, 2 weeks from now, let's set up a field trip. Let's get over to this particular location and shoot some footage there. So that predictable footage is really awesome to know you're going to need, because if you can kind of get out there and film, and it helps if you're a filmmaker to not be stuck doing research all the time, to kind of get to grab your camera and go out and film stuff really early on in the process. It can kind of get you excited. Like, all right, we're making a movie, right? We're doing this for real. So I think it's a great thing, especially if it's being done in a class, to like take the whole class out. Hey, we're going to go out. We know we're doing this thing on invasive species. So we're going out in the local park and we're going to film all the invasive species that we find, right? Just like find something predictable and get everyone out there and try and create something. And that can be a great way to start, get everyone revved up. And if you're making it independently, if you're a student working on your own, it's the same deal. It's like, it's going to be awesome if you can get out there tomorrow and start filming footage for a film you're going to want to make. And sometimes it's even like I had a protest on immigration that popped up, and we hadn't quite nailed down what the subject matter of the film was going to be. But it's like, once you decide to make a documentary, you are now a documentary filmmaker, even if you don't even know what that documentary is going to be for sure yet. Tell yourself you're a documentary filmmaker, because what happened for me is I knew we were going to do something on immigration and I wasn't sure what. And someone called me up and said, hey, there's this gentleman in town and he might get deported tonight. And so there's going to be a vigil at his house. These people are going to be there supporting him. The community's coming out. We're hoping to discourage the deportation from happening. Do you want to show up? And I'm like, all right, let's go. I'm not exactly sure what film we're going to be making yet. I know we're going to make a film, but I'm thinking I'm a documentary filmmaker, so I'm going to this. So those are things that can happen at the start of the process, right? It's the predictable footage. What stuff out there can you film that you can predict would be really helpful for you to have for your final film, right? So that's a really, really important one. The final piece is what I was talking at the beginning about, which is once your film is assembled, once you've made all your selects, I like to think of it as like the sort of metaphors. It usually happens as something that wasn't predictable because someone used some kind of personal anecdote or some kind of metaphor, like the example of the preacher talking about the ocean and capital punishment. You can't predict that someone is going to use some particular visualization in their interview, that they're going to visually describe something in their interview or visually reference something in there. Like, it was a really beautiful day. I remember walking outside and the birds were chirping and there was sunlight coming through the leaves, or it was a really rainy day. We did a documentary recently about a Native American tribe in town, and the chief remembered that the day his tribe got rejected for their federal recognition status, that it was rainy. And another tribe member corroborated that. Remember, it was rainy and the chief was out at his mom's gravesite on the reservation. And so we knew, once we had this movie assembled, we realized this part of it, this piece that he described, was so essential. And so we're going, this is such a visualization, right? They're describing rain. So I remember at one point we were driving back from a shoot and it started to rain. And I had a student who knew that had been editing this, putting these pieces together. He's like, this is the rain shot. So he started just filming out through like the windshield of the bus. I was hitting the wiper, the wipers are going. So we get like a close up of just the wiper blades and like the raindrops on the window. I'm like, all right, so we have a rain shot. And then we got out of the bus and we started filming like the puddles and the rain dropping in the puddles. So we started grabbing all this footage because we knew that something totally unpredictable until this movie was pretty much edited, that we were going to focus so much on the chief talking about this day when it rained and they didn't get their tribal recognition. And so we needed all this footage of it raining. So you don't know, these are the unpredictable things, and you don't know until you edit it. That's why it's so important for that final part 3 there, is get your film not necessarily finished, but as edited as possible, so you can start planning out, like you might need to go out and do other shoots. So you don't want to be trying to figure all this stuff out in like April or May. You want your film really assembled sooner than that, so that you can kind of start making plans of like, all right, guys, what else might we need that could help tell the story better in a more interesting way? So those are my 3 things, right? It's stock footage, stock photos, right? Finding things that already exist. So archival footage, archival photos that you know are going to help tell your story. And it's something you can be doing throughout the entire process, right? You can always be trying to think about, oh, hey, here's some interesting newspaper article about some event, or here's this person was at this protest. Can we find some photos from this protest? Can we find something else like that? That also includes like cell phone footage that someone might shoot. So we had a film about the Cricket Valley energy plant being built over in just over the border in New York State. And there was a protest. So the protest happened before we started making the film, but we got cell phone footage. We asked the activists, do you have cell phone footage that you can share with us? And they ended up only having a YouTube video, but we pulled footage from the YouTube video, and I think it worked really well. And so we had that. So it's those kind of things that sort of found footage, right? So stock footage. Then there's the stuff that you're going to shoot on the day of your interview. That's 2, right? So what can we get when we go out for an interview? Can we get something? Can we see the person we're interviewing doing something? So it's not just their talking head, but we can actually cut to them working or writing something or walking down the hall, or anything. Like, what can you think of creatively establishing shots of the location where they are, where they live, where they work, shots of the town. It's nice after an interview just to like walk around town and sort of look around this area and film and get some ideas of what you could use for your film. But at this point, you're guessing, right? You're shooting footage thinking like, maybe we'll use this, maybe this. And so you're kind of guessing, but you're collecting it so you have it. And then the final part, right, we just talked about part 3, B-roll category 3, is the stuff that was totally unpredictable, but you're not guessing anymore. Your film is assembled and you need this. I mean, I've worked on films where it was like, oh my God, we just need a close-up of an American flag waving in the breeze. And the film was due basically the next day. So I remember our students we were like looking online for a good flag waving, just YouTube video of an American flag waving, and we couldn't really find anything good. And we, ended up trying to film out the window at school, trying to get the American flag at school was on this really high flagpole and it was really tiny and our camera couldn't zoom in enough. And like we were dying just trying to get like a shot. We just wanted this American flag waving in the background for this B-roll. And we got something we could use, but it wasn't what our vision would have been, right? So that's the thing. It's like that's sort of like the unpredictable stuff that you eventually know you need. And it's usually something very specific and many times metaphorical. So it can be hard to find the right visualization. So give yourself time at the end of your process. All right, so there we go. We got our 3 types of B-roll, right? We know we want to finish our film a little bit early, or at least get an assembly done early so we can kind of predict what kind of B-roll we're going to get. The next thing is to, when it comes to B-roll, is start thinking about creativity. And this means like every good director takes risks. So many times when we shoot B-roll, and we'll get into this more in the next section, which is going to be about actually filming on location, but I just want you to think about in general, whether you're a student or a teacher, is how to inspire those people around you to take risks with their camera work. In other words, don't film everything from like eye level, just looking around like this. That's how everyone else sees the world. So start thinking about, like, when I tell my story, how can I tell it visually in a really interesting way? That could mean an interesting camera angle. It could mean just thinking of a sequence that someone wouldn't have thought. That's not obvious, right? An obvious sequence is a guy saying, I woke up and I sipped a cup of coffee. And so you have a shot of everything he literally is saying. You have a dude waking up. You have this guy, you see a cup of coffee going up to someone's lips and there's some steam rising off of it. That's obvious. Can you be more creative than that? Can you say, hey, okay, so it's the morning. He's saying he's waking up. You know what I want to do? I want to have like a drone shot at 7 a.m. over the river of like the camera swooping through clouds, low clouds over the river, watching the sunrise, right? Like, you know, do you want to can you get more creative in how you tell that story? So try and inspire people around you to be, to come up with ideas. And one way I love to do that is with storyboards. Storyboards are really, really cool. And it can be really hard with a documentary to storyboard. I'll say that right now. If I'm making a film that's a fiction film, once I have my script done, I make a storyboard, which is basically like a comic strip, right? So little boxes, right? And in each little box, I start drawing my shots. I might have the lines of dialogue or description of the actual moment written under that. You can't really do that for a documentary, but you can think of, again, it's about sort of a predictable sequence of saying like, okay, well, we know this is an important idea in our film, so can I create a little sequence? Can I create a little scene? Because you don't always want your B-roll to kind of stand alone. Like, okay, so this guy talked about, for the Scotticoke film, this gentleman talks about, this is on the Native Americans, the tribe members sitting around drumming in the circle. So you could say, okay, I need a shot of a tribe member drumming, but you might think, no, you know what, maybe more complex than that. Maybe I want to see more shots in the sequence of someone like getting this drum out, and I want like a close-up of the drum being situated in the dirt, and I want to see someone starting to play, and then my opening credits start going, and then the drum beat starts going faster, and I'm seeing more opening credits, and then he starts describing of them being there at this drum circle, right? So start thinking sort of creatively. Try to think of what moments in my story could lend themselves to maybe be expanded visually, so I can actually make a scene, not just a shot we cut to when someone references like coffee cup, drum, but instead think of like, can I actually build a scene where we can see multiple shots in a row that actually makes it feel like I'm watching a movie. So something to think about, think creatively, have some fun. All right, it's a lot of information. I hope you guys are following along. So this next part is about what do we do when we're actually on location. So there's a few tips and tricks I want to give you when you're actually filming on location at a site. The first one is use a tripod. 101, you think when you're holding your camera that it's really stable, but it's shaky. And when you blow your footage up to the big screen, it's going to be a lot shakier than you think it is. And it's going to feel amateurish. And you don't want to do that because people are kind of expecting when they see a student film that it's going to be kind of like, yeah. So if you show up with some really stable footage, immediately you've kind of you've beaten the expectations, right? You've kind of shown up with something a little above and beyond. So use a tripod. If you don't have access to a tripod, balance your camera on something. I've definitely been on locations where I'm shooting on my phone or shooting with my DSLR, and I put my elbows, I rest them on something. So some type of stabilization, because this is not cool. This is not going to help make a good movie. You just looking around randomly is not going to help you have a good film or a winning film. If you want a good film, stabilize your B-roll, stabilize your interview, stabilize everything. So a tripod, use a tripod. Once your camera is on a tripod, there are two kinds of camera moves that you can do on a tripod. Very specific. You need to know this. So there is a pan. A pan is side to side. You don't ever say, I'm panning up, I'm panning down. You can pan right, you can pan left, but you don't pan up and down. Panning is just this horizontal movement, okay? And I say that because as a professional, anytime I work for someone else, they always say pan for everything. They go pan in, then pan over here, then pan this way. These are not pans. These are not pans, people. A pan is left, right. A tilt is up, down. So this is a tilt, and this is a pan. Now, why does this matter? Why does the terminology matter? Because we want to be able to, A, communicate with each other, right? You want to be able to say to someone, hey, I want an exterior of the town hall, and then, tilt up to the American flag and then tilt back down to the main entrance, right? So it's clear, and it's clear for you to communicate. And then if you're the camera operator, it's also clear, because now you're not thinking, oh, they want a shot with like a camera move of the town hall. All right, my camera will be here, and then I'll go here. No, you're going, it's a tilt. A tilt is easy. A tilt just goes like this. Now, you might think, but that's boring, Ben. Like, I don't want to make a movie like that. Well, once you make one awesome movie following the basics, then you can start breaking all the rules. But people are used to seeing these kind of shots, right? They're used to seeing a tilt. They're used to seeing a pan. So if you have your camera on a tripod and you just stick to panning and tilting and panning, then people are going to watch your film and they'll think it's good. And then after that, you made one good film, then you can start breaking your rules on the second film. So tilts and pans, very important. My tip, when you're on location and you're shooting on a tripod and you're doing pans and tilts, is that I call it the 10-second rule, right? So if you're doing something like this, you're doing a camera move, you're doing a pan, or you're doing a tilt, what you want to do is pick the starting point, pick the ending point, and hold on each one for 10 seconds, 10 seconds, right? So in other words, that same scene I described to you of shot rather of filming the front of the town hall. And I'm going to go from the front doors to the American flag. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hold on the front door. So I'm on a tripod on the front door for 10 seconds. And 10 seconds on camera is an eternity when you're on location. So I always tell students, watch the counter. So there's usually a little timer when you start recording where it says like you've been filming for 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. Watch that. I usually after about 3 or 4 seconds, I get very bored. So if you can really wait for 10 seconds, do it. I usually don't. After about 5 seconds, I'm like, all right, that's enough. But what you do is you hold for a while on this one location. So we're holding on the front door of the town hall in this scenario. And then we slowly are going to do our tilt to the American flag. And then guess what we do? We're going to hold for 10 seconds again. So think about that. That's the 10-second rule. You pick your opening shot, you pick your landing shot, and you'll be on 10 seconds for both of those. So you stay here, and then you'll tilt up and you stay there. The next part of this is then you reverse it. Then you go from this spot, and then you go back down to where you started from, okay? So it's 10 seconds. You hold on the first thing, you move to the second, and then you reverse it. Now, why do this? The point of doing this is that, those are my dogs barking in the back. I'm very sorry. Maxie Mufasa. It's okay. So why do we do that? Well, the point is that many times when we're on location, as I talked about before, if we're filming an interview, our film hasn't been assembled. We don't know the specific shots the editor is going to need. So we try and shoot our footage in a way that gives the editor as many options as possible. So that's why if I have it here for 10 seconds, the editor can decide, I just want this shot of the town hall, just like that. No camera move, nothing. The camera move is taking too much time. I want 1 second front door of the town hall. In this move up here, the editor can decide, well, yeah, I like it. You know, all I need is this little tilt up to the American flag. I just want to tilt to the American flag. We reversed it so the editor can also decide, no, I want it to tilt down to the front door, right? So you do that. So by shooting it, do your camera move and reverse it, you allow the editor to decide when they want to come in on the shot. Is it going to be moving this way? Is it going to be moving this way? Is it just going to be a still shot here or a still shot here? You've basically given them 4 different shots to use, and all you did was just go up, down. You did that, boom, they got 4 different shots they could use for their film. That's awesome. The other thing to think about here when you're doing these camera moves is just that by having it for 10 seconds, it also helps you observe as a filmmaker, right? Sometimes when I'm sitting, I turn my camera on and I'm watching something, I start noticing things I wouldn't have noticed before because we're sitting there and we're watching the clock tick for 10 seconds. So we start thinking about things. And that can help you start to notice things you didn't see before. Maybe it's the way someone gets out of their car and walks into the shot and leaves. The editor can then decide, do they want this person passing by? Do they not want them? So holding for a bit can be really helpful. The other thing to do when you are doing those kind of shots, right? When you're doing a camera move, so maybe it's a pan or it's a tilt, is before you start rolling, decide on what your first and your last shot are going to be. That's really important too, because you don't want to kind of rush into it and you kind of tilt up to a bad shot. I usually, before I even start rolling, I kind of get my first shot stabilized. Then I go to my second shot and I kind of like adjust that. And I'm like, all right, can I get between these two? Can I do this camera move? Does it work? And once I kind of have it down, then I'm like, all right, let's film this. Start rolling, 10 seconds, do the move, 10 seconds, reverse it, and you go through that process. So that probably is the best advice I can give you. And if you end up working for a TV news crew, I've worked with lots of television newsmen over the years, and I'd say that's probably the number one piece of advice they give, is because they're like, you know, we got to edit so much stuff. Like, just give me something good. That's like, you hold right here, pan here, come back, just give me that. It's so helpful. So that's my advice there. And again, you know, being an observer, it's so good to pause, not just be staring through your viewfinder, but actually just looking around. And that moment many times happens when I have that 10-second shot and I'm just holding for 10 seconds. I kind of might start looking around and seeing things. Frequently for me personally, when I'm filming B-roll, my best footage comes at the very end, because a lot of times when I start shooting on a location, I'm kind of shooting the predictable things. Like, yeah, that's a nice view, or hey, there's the front of the town hall, I'm going to film that. And as you start to play in the space and move and become more familiar with the location you're filming, you start seeing more creative angles. Like, oh, hey, maybe I can be down here and rack focus from some flowers in the foreground to this American flag in the background. Maybe I can film these people slightly out of focus walking in and out of City Hall. Right, you start getting more creative as you're seeing the space. So spend some time, slow down, notice things, observe things. Okay, so let's talk about things you can do when you're on location to make your footage better. First one is white balance. So I know, hey, this seems so silly. Why white balance? Who cares? White balance is really important. White balance is important because the sunlight outside to a camera can seem very blue, while indoor incandescent lights can seem very warm. So if your camera is balanced for indoors, and you usually see that there's usually a white balance preset and it's got a little light bulb on it, you have that set when you're outside. That setting is adding blue to the footage because it's trying to offset the warm color you get from indoor lighting. So it adds blue. You go outside, you film with that same setting, and your footage ends up being really blue. It's probably the most common thing I see. It's like students shoot stuff, it's either looks blue or very flat. So if you want to make your footage look good, use a white balance preset. If you're outside, set it for like cloudy day. I like that because it kind of warms it up a little bit. If you're inside, you can set it for whatever kind of indoor lighting you're dealing with, whether it's a tungsten, so you see a little light bulb image. Many cameras have a fluorescent setting. So that's like the easy way, is to do it that way. There's also a way to set your white balance on most cameras, where you actually use a white card like that, and you would hold it up, and you would take it takes a little image of that for a second, and it sets a white balance based on that. So a camera with like a touchscreen, like a DSLR, it'll have a manual mode for setting up white balance, which you could like Google a YouTube video for your particular camera. And you'll set it like that so it knows that this is white. I even had it where I've forgotten on shoots to set my white balance or change it, but I do always try and make a point when I'm setting up my shot to go in and hold up a white card, because even then later, like in Adobe Premiere, if I can tell the computer that this is white, it can sort of solve the issues with the rest of the color in the image. So setting your white balance is the first thing, a really good thing to do. If you're making your film on a cell phone, lucky you, most cell phones are just set to an auto white balance. They sometimes have like override or different filters, but usually you're okay there. If you're on a DSLR, you just got to make sure that either, like, am I on auto white balance? Am I setting my own? Just consciously make a choice there. If you're outside, definitely make sure you're shooting for like sunny or overcast day conditions, or just hold up a white piece of paper, and then we can always figure it out later in post-production, but better to figure it out when you're actually on set, on location filming. So you have your white balance, first thing. Next thing, greatest tip I can give you in shooting B-roll is frame speed, right? And what's frame speed? Okay, so here's frame speed. Films are 24 frames a second. Television is 29.97, or short is 30 frames a second, right? So that means the image is just on a film is 24 individual film frames. So you go to a feature film at the movie theater, every second you're seeing 24 still images, and those play really fast. In 1 second, these 24 images play, and that's called the persistence of vision, right? Wow, motion, right? That's how we're able to go from photography to create the moving image and create movies, right? So it's 24 frames a second. Television was different. Television was 30 frames, so 30 still images in a second. Well, here's what's cool. On some cameras, you can shoot at a higher frame rate. So you could shoot at 60 frames a second. You could shoot at 120 frames a second. If you're filming B-roll, my suggestion is shoot at that higher frame rate. Why? Why would I want to do that? Well, because of that, when I play it back, if I tell Adobe Premiere, interpret this 60 frames a second as 30, everything's playing back 50% slower. And it looks really clear. It's not like that crummy, like slow it down later in post-production where it kind of blends frames and it's all blurry. You get really crisp, clean imagery. And this is really, really, really helpful because many times a really powerful image in your film, it may have been very quick, right? When you're filming on location, something can happen very quickly and you only caught it for a second, right? Sometimes it's that you have someone who's actually working for who's being interviewed, demonstrating some technique or doing some work, and you only catch something in your camera operator, especially if you're just starting out, you're a student, you're very quick and you only grab it for a second, or you thought you had it for longer, but it was only 2 seconds, which felt like an eternity in real life. And so you didn't get a lot. But if you shot at a high frame rate, this one little moment, this 1 millisecond, something happened in, now happens over a longer period. And it is so helpful. I mean, the number one thing that I did to improve the B-roll I shoot for documentaries is to shoot at a higher frame rate, because I can play it back at normal speed and it's totally fine. If it's 60 frames a second and my film is a 30 frame a second film, the computer will just automatically turn that 60 into 30 frames. It'll play it back at normal speed. But I can also tell it that this is a 30 frame a second footage and it'll play it back in very slow motion. So that ability is so important. And even if you're shooting on your phone, guess what? Most phones, I know my phone has a little slow-mo button I can click on and I can shoot footage in slow motion and it looks really good. I was impressed like 5 years ago when they started offering the slow-mo feature on these phones, how good it was. So it can be really, really helpful. Another thing that the slow-mo feature can do is it smooths out bad camera work. In other words, if I decide to go handheld and it's kind of shaky like that, if you did it in slow motion, it's not shaky like this, it's flowing like that, Now this camera move is so much smoother. So when I film using a gimbal, whether it's a gimbal that holds my phone or a large gimbal that my camera fits on, I always shoot in slow motion. So if you're lucky enough to have a gimbal for your phone, before you start using that gimbal, set your camera to slow motion. If you're shooting on a DSLR and you're on a gimbal, or you're doing some cool handheld camera move that you want to try out, set it to slow motion, because when you play that back in slow motion, it's going to smooth out all the camera moves and everything's going to feel really gentle. It's going to look really nice. And again, if something only happens in a split second, by shooting in slow motion, you have so much more footage of that split second. And that can helps you cover a lot more time in your film. So that's probably the number one thing. Just a little pro tip, if you're editing in Adobe Premiere, you can basically, there's an option to interpret footage. And you can, and I will, if you ever have questions about this, you can email me. I would definitely help you out with this. You can even Google how to interpret footage, and they have plenty of YouTube videos explaining how to do it. But you can tell the Adobe Premiere to interpret, say 60 frame a second footage as 30 frames a second. So you can tell it to do that, and then it slows down the whole clip and play it back in slow motion. So that's different than having a slow-mo feature in your phone. Slow-mo features usually don't record audio. So if I set my GoPro, my drone shoots has a slow-mo setting. It also has a 60 frames per second setting. I use a 60 frames per second, and I do that with like my GoPro, with anything, because then I also get the sound, and so I can choose to use the sound or not use the sound. Sometimes I love the slow-mo sound, sometimes I don't. So you have that, and that's very helpful to use. So I like that. I like to choose just the higher frame rate over just the slow-mo. Now the trade-off is if you shoot in slow-mo, the footage is automatically in slow motion and it's just ready to go. If you just shoot at a higher frame rate, you have to do the whole interpret footage thing in Adobe. You got to watch the YouTube video and figure out how to do it. So, there's a trade-off with both, but no matter what, shoot at a higher frame rate. It's going to make your B-roll look so much better. Okay. Then let's get into just a little bit more about camera stabilization. I'll try and move quickly through this. I did mention shooting on a tripod. I also mentioned those really cool gimbals for your phone. I know a lot of people might be making their movies on a phone using those gimbals. They're not too expensive, or maybe you have a friend you can borrow one from, but those gimbals that your phone can mount on are really, really cool to add some value to your film, right? So just something to think about. If you don't have a tripod and you don't have a gimbal, the best thing you could do for stabilization on location is take your elbows and squeeze them into your ribs like that. So you're squeezing your elbows in really tightly, and then you kind of have like T-Rex arms, and then hold your camera there. So you're creating this sort of tripod with your body. Okay, so that's kind of the tip. But if you can, use a tripod. You're gonna love using a tripod. Now, finally, in our final portion here, I want to talk to you a little bit about using your B-roll in post-production. The biggest thing that my more advanced students run into is audio popping in and out. In other words, you shoot something at like the highway, then you shot something in town, then you were in a little field. So your audio is different, right? Each of these B-roll shots have their own audio associated with them, and you have your interview audio. So the audio is cutting in and out, and it creates these little pops, right? Every time the audio changes, and it's jarring. It throws people off. So there are two kinds of edits we do in filmmaking. There's the L cut, and there's the J cut. Or maybe it was, I think this is flipped around, so whatever, L or J, right? So an L cut basically means the L is the footage stops, and then the bottom of the L is the audio keeps going. Okay, so an L cut is the footage ends, right? You have this beautiful meadow with a bird in it. Stop. When you make that cut, don't cut the audio in the same place. Let your audio keep going for a little bit. And you can fade that audio out. You can let that audio slowly fade out. And then you have the new scene, the new shot go over it. So by doing that kind of cut, right, the visual stops, the audio goes a little bit further and fades out. That's an L cut because it's shaped like an L, right? The audio is still going. This is audio. This is the cut for the video. By doing an L cut like that, you let that audio keep going. It smooths out those kind of pops, which is really nice. And it makes your whole film feel connected, right? Not like a bunch of disjointed shots being thrown at you. So the L cut's really, really helpful. More creative is the J cut. The J cut's interesting because the audio starts before the footage starts. this is something that's used much more in sort of narrative fiction feature films, where you might have like this one scene ends and it fades out and you start hearing the sounds of something and then the visuals come up. I frequently will use that, say for the opening of the film. I like to ask my students, what's the first thing the audience is going to hear? And then what's the first thing they're going to see in your film? So I ask them to imagine the movie theater is dark and the opening credits come up, you know, blah, 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 school presents, name of your film here, directed by, there's your name. And under it, okay, we're hearing something. Now, is it music that we're hearing? Is it, for one film I did, the students really wanted to open with a protest. So we did a J cut, which meant we heard the sound of the protest first. So we heard, and it slowly faded up of like people yelling and chanting and yelling and chanting. And it was just a black screen and the credits are going. We may have actually, that might have been the one we used the American flag. And then we fade into this footage from like YouTube of these protesters protesting the specific issue. So that's the J cut. So L cut, the audio keeps going after the cut, which is going to be the most common thing you do. And so many times what I'll do is like, I'll cut to some B-roll footage and I'll just have, the audio just keeps going for just a little bit longer. And so that way the person starts speaking again for my interview. And the audio from the B-roll is fading out as they're speaking. And I might even let them fade in a little bit. So give a little bit more room. So a little bit of a J cut. So they start to fade in a bit and then they start talking. Their audio is already starting to come up. So that way no audio is just popping in at full blast and then cutting out from full blast, because that's going to cause some jarring issues with your film. Another tip with B-roll, talking about audio, sort of what volume to use. So kind of a rule of thumb, some filmmakers I know I work with a lot, Catherine Taji and Dominique Lesoeur taught me this one, which was to turn, your B-roll should be at 50%, right? So if whatever level my audio is at for my interviews, kind of keeping my B-roll at 50%, specifically when there is B-roll footage over an interview, right? I don't want to turn my B-roll audio down all the way because it makes the footage kind of not feel alive. So I want it to be up. So for me, what I do now is many times I turn that audio down a lot and just have my my interview person speaking, and the footage is, and the B-roll is playing over that. And then I just start to turn up my B-roll just a little bit, just enough where I can just hear a little bit, but it's not distracting from the interview. And it helps that just having a little bit of audio of the B-roll can help that image come to life a little more. It feels a little more like I'm there and I'm experiencing that, which is really important. So wow, time is flying. There's so much I want to cover. So I'm gonna try and figure out what would make the most sense. I think, talking a little bit more about audio for B-roll, collecting audio itself in a way can also be kind of B-roll. And so that's something else to think about. It's not really B-roll, it's audio. But it can really help a film. So I was working on this film, as I mentioned at the beginning of this, with students about the river temperature monitoring. So we recorded audio of the actual river, right? So thinking about audio that I might want can be really helpful, and it's helpful to know that. So if I'm at a protest, I don't want to be behind my camera being like, oh man, get that shot over there, oh, pan over there, and you get all that footage. I want to know that, hey, you know what? I want some really clean audio of these people protesting and yelling their chant. So let's just do a wide shot. Let's not touch anything, because you can usually hear when someone's touching the camera, on the audio. Just take our hands off and just let's get like a minute of good, clean audio in this location. So that can really help too, because once you have an audio track like that, you can really put that anywhere in your film. And that can really help bring it to life. So that's B-roll. There was some more things. There was one more thing that's escaping me right now, but it's not in my notes I just thought of, but maybe it'll come back to me as I wrap this up. So just to review, as I promised, very quickly, okay? 3 kinds of B-roll you're going to want, right? So stock footage and photos, right? Those are things you can start researching on day one. As soon as you know what your topic is, you can start looking for photos. You could assign someone in your group, on your team, like, get me photos, make a Google Drive and just fill this one folder with photos, and make a Google Doc and fill it with links to different footage. that could be really good for my film. So stock footage like that, especially stuff from news organizations, the Associated Press, great place to go to. Because like going to Getty Images gets expensive. So aparchives.org is what you want to do for that. Then you have footage that you will shoot at interviews. So when you go on an interview, get footage on those interview days, whether it's establishing shots or footage of like that person just walking down a hallway. Anything you get with them, trust me, you're going to be so desperate for footage at the end of this process. You will be so glad you got anything on that day. So don't like be upset, like, oh, I don't know if we're gonna get something good. I don't want to ask. Get footage on those interview days. You're going to be so happy that you did. All right. And finally, right, it's that footage that you don't know you're going to need until the very end. So try and get an assembly. Make those selects once your interviews are done. Finish your interviews like halfway through the school year so that you can spend time, the rest of your time, picking out the best moments and being like, I'm going to want to visualize that. I mean, for me, many times after an interview, I like to ask my students or ask myself, what stands out for me from that interview? Before I even rewatch it, just what do I remember? And if there's some moment that I really remember that was like so awesome, the way someone described something, I'm gonna immediately go, okay, guys, what could we film for that particular moment? So that way, maybe you could get ahead of it a little bit. And then again, when you're on interviews, I mean, when you're on B-roll shoots, use a tripod or a gimbal, some kind of stabilization, or get your elbows on something or squeeze them into your sides. So stabilization, stabilization, stabilization. Very, very important. And then finally, shoot at a high frame rate. So shoot in slow motion, shoot at 60 frames a second, shoot at 120 frames a second. That's going to help you so much with your B-roll. And finally, white balance. Check your white balance. Make sure either use an auto white balance setting, hold up a white card and manually set the white balance for your camera. That's really important. And when you're editing, use those L cuts, right? So when a shot ends, don't just cut the audio, fade that audio out. Let that audio just slowly fade out. That can really help bring your film to life. So it's 8 o'clock. That's B-roll. I know it was a lot. I hope this helps you make your film. Again, like you can definitely want to learn more about B-roll. As I said, things like making J cuts, L cuts, interpreting footage, any of those things I mentioned. You can Google or YouTube specific things, and there's so much out there that you can discover if there's a really specific technique that you want to learn more about. Also, you can always email me, and I'm happy to provide feedback when you're working on projects. All right, guys? All right. Have a good one, and good luck with your films.